Hey folks, it's Bear Gardener, and it's here. It's patch time. It has been not actually that long, basically a month since we saw Covert Operations, and we have just had the new balance patch for July. So, before we get started, as always, I am a Kards Content Creator. You can find me at all the things down below. Member of the Kards Contributor Program. Please go check out that and all of my fellow contributors on there as well. There's loads of people doing really cool content. I am a somewhat decent, generally accepted to be quite good cards player, a big advocate for new player and new player content, which is probably what I'm best known for, but I also do quite a lot of stuff on balance and design, and because I have a background in tabletop design rather than card game design, but anyway, there are some crossover skills, and I've been playing card games for 30 odd years, so I kind of know where I'm coming from. Anyway, this is the thing. So it is time to take a look at the July balance patch and give you my thoughts. But first of all, it's a good idea, I think, to talk about the patch in general. So here's the thing. Covert Operations dropped and brought with it a whole slew of upgraded, polished and new mechanics and ideas, a number of which were really, really interesting. Several of which were incredibly strong. So you will possibly, if you are a follower of just general discussion of cards, know that there's an awful lot of discussion that's been going on for the past 28-ish days about this whole deal and how people feel about the new Covert Operations stuff and balance points. I've done my own video on changes that I want done, and spoilers, I'll be referencing some of my thoughts in here. The big thing to understand is that we got to the point whereby certain things became very prominent. So from the point of view of the new player experience and lower ranks and general climb to Field Marshal, I don't know, because my experience really is rank 6 and above, and that's about what I've got. I don't have a full new player account going at the moment. I think I've been about as low as rank 8 or 9 this month on my new player account, and I haven't played a lot on there either. And we've seen a lot of the same things. But at the upper end, things diluted down really quite severely, to the point whereby at one point there were basically 3 playable decks at top end, which was to say Britair, the German US or various variants thereof Blitz Doctrine deck. You do with Japan versions. I've seen Soviet versions which weren't that great, but Blitz Doctrine just became a thing, and it was usually US Germany or Germany US, because Bomber Mafia will get there. And finally, Japan Aggro Self-Credit Denial, and these were the decks that you were laddering with. You might occasionally see something else, or someone would push a different thing, but for the most part, that was what we were seeing. And we've talked quite a bit about meta warping and the changes being a little too pervasive and all-encompassing. So a lot of people, myself included, were waiting for this balance patch with a certain degree of anticipation, because we really want to see what the changes are. The other thing that is new, and you will almost certainly have experienced, whatever level you're playing at, is the developed mechanic, and in particular Retribution, or Ramp-tribution, which is the US ramp into Retribution with whatever ally you choose to add. Usually Britain for developed cards, but I've seen all sorts. And this was the cards are flying across your screen, opponent delays out, goes late game. Another reason why Britain's a good choice of ally, and then just uses Retribution to basically trigger Yank and get a million different develops on cards until they get the exact set of cards they need to wipe your board and then slowly but surely just obliterate your HQ defense while destroying everything that you can put in front of it. You will almost certainly have come across versions of this deck because it has become incredibly popular. I'm not going to be honest, I personally don't like it. I've been on record as saying this. It's one of the reasons that I backed away from Hearthstone, was the discover mechanic, which is the develop mechanic. I'm sorry, they're the same thing. There's very little difference. But anyway, we'll get into that when we talk about any changes to that. Anyway, this was the situation. This is where we'd gotten to. A lot of people were crying out for lots of different nerfs and changes. I've done my own video, other people have done their thoughts, and there's been lots of discussion on Discord and in other places. Some of it got a bit impassioned. Some of it got really quite unpleasant. I understand why, because things were becoming really, really focused in specific areas and people weren't loving it, and I get that, but I will always try and be the voice of moderation in this, because I do also understand the design side of this, which is you don't ever want to release anything too weak. So for those of you watching this video who are partly on how the blazes did we end up getting these cards out in the state that they were in the first place? Right, so I will talk to you bluntly as a developer. The reason you did is what we would call the low power blind spot. At least that's what I would call it in tabletop RPGs, but there are different versions of it. But basically it boils down to, if something comes out and isn't good, or it is actively bad, even if you buff it later, people just don't notice it because it automatically fits into the headspace of, that's a terrible card, it's always been a terrible card, it was a terrible card when it released, or well, design or mechanic, whatever format. People don't look back over it. This blind spot has been proven. It has been proven both in kind of personal experience, but it's also been proven in actual research. There is research in there into market design and development research and market kind of acceptance, and it is a thing. The blind spot is real. If you want to see an example of it, you could actually go and watch the video that I did with J King over on his channel, where we talked about a card as a little Japanese tank that added another card to your hand, and no one realised for ages because it was a bit awful when it came out, and then eventually people suddenly woke up and went, wow, this is good. But anyway, it does happen. Blind spots occur. So, most of the time, as a developer or a designer, you want to release a little overtuned, emphasis on a little, which is sometimes where it goes wrong, and then tune back, rather than release undertuned and have to tune up. Because when you tune up, people just don't even think about the card because they've already put it in the waste box, and that's not a good sign. So, anyway, that's my little piece on the ethos of design and why I do actually get where we landed here, kind of, although when it comes to the develop mechanic and Retribution, I was a little bit more impassioned about the fact that no, sorry. Love you, 1939 developers, that one was just, you just dropped the ball. That's not just releasing overtuned, that was just never going to be a good idea and could have been caught at the beginning but wasn't, and such is life. But we'll see whether it has been now. So, what we're going to do is I'm going to go through the whole balance patch article like I did with the last one. We'll read through the text, see what it's got to say for itself, and then I'll give you my opinions. So, time to hop to the internet. Also time to drink tea, because I'm British. Right, so here it is. This is the July 2024 Balance Patch Dev blog. So, let's go from the top. Hello friends, 1939 Games are just about to head out on vacation and disappear into the summer sun, but we didn't want to leave without moving some numbers around first to make us feel important. Nice funny opening line, and I get why in a very difficult environment. On the whole, the Covert Operations expansion has been a success, with new and old archetypes showing up and various new strategies and cards to humiliate your opponent with the only reason we play, right? Yeah, just a little on the nose, but okay. Still, there are a few cards that are a little too good at the humiliation game and need to be humiliated themselves. Read nerfed. Yes, there are. With all the fancy technical talk out of the way, let's take a look at what's coming in the new balance patch, which will start rolling out on Tuesday the 9th of July. That's tomorrow at the time of recording. Keep an eye out for the patch notes as well, as there are many bug fixes included in the patch as well. Be interesting to see what those are, but we'll keep our eyes open. We'll start looking at a number of cards that are being realigned into a more reasonable form, and then end with a few additional ones getting a slight facelift to round things out. Okay, so we're going to open up with nerfs. I get it. I actually appreciate taking the time to have a bit of a play on words and try and make this article at least marginally playful, because there is a lot of impassionedness going around at the moment. I'm good with that. So let's see what we've got. You can see from the bottom of the screen what the first card that we're going to be looking at is. This is the Shark Mark III. It's a big part of Britair. We're going to start with the text, and then I'll come back and talk about the actual change. Just when you thought Britair was dead and buried for good, along came this predatory seaplane, allowing a Britair to start snatching victories from the jaws of defeat yet again. It now no longer counts itself as a friend, so if you want to get the same boatload of damage as before, you're going to need a bigger boat, my friend. Cute, funny, let's look at the changes. So, one, I've had it asked of me, does Shark, or did Shark, need a change? The short answer is yes. It was too strong. Straight up, it was a universally amazing card. It didn't make my big list of really, really important changes, because I don't think Britair was at the time as dominant as certain other decks were going to be, and I didn't feel the issue was egregious, but I've been asked in private and on various Discords and forums, and yes, I do think Shark needs a change. Let's look at what they've gone with. So Shark, on release, it was a 2-1, so 2 cost, 1 op cost, 1/2 bomber. It's a special, and it had deployment. Deal damage to target enemy equal to friendly air units. This is incredibly strong, because 1, it can target HQ, and 2, that can be quite a lot of damage. Really quite a lot of damage, depending on what air you've got. Certainly 3 or 4 is the norm. The new change is actually not what I expected. I had expected to see Shark go up to maybe be 3 cost, or have an op cost bump to make it more about the effect and less about its long-term impact on the board, because of course it's also a bomber that you can buff with close air support and sea embargo. What we actually get is that everything remains the same, but we get deployment, deal damage to target enemy equal to other friendly air units. This is actually a very neat change. I like it. It just brings the power level down a tiny bit. The initial impact is slightly less pronounced. Honestly, as long as the other changes to the more, in my opinion, egregiously problematic decks are strong enough, this is perfectly reasonable, just to put Britair in a position whereby it is less likely that you're going to watch someone do what I have done on a regular basis, which is deploy a random 1-cost aircraft, and then, because of the existence of the developer mechanic, play 3 consecutive Sharks, targeting HQ, for 2, then 3, then 4 damage. Seriously, 7 points of damage to HQ off 3 cards and more body. I have done this. You're not going to see that. It slows it down. It means deploying Shark naked is bad. Truly bad. This card can actually brick, because it doesn't count itself. And honestly, that's a good thing. I'm fine with this as a change. I don't think it's going to particularly kill Britair. It just gives slightly less utility and means you're going to have to think your plays through a bit better to use Shark to get yourself out of trouble. Yeah, works for me. So what's next? Next, we have a change. We're going to get to this. I'm going to read the text, then I'm going to tell a story, and then we'll get to the actual thing. So, 20 Panzergrenadier. Too much vitamin D can cause nausea, vomiting, muscle weakness, and confusion. The 20 Panzergrenadier's time in the sun has become so prolonged that most of us are starting to experience these side effects when encountering it. Honestly, whoever wrote this, well done. Sometimes too much of good stuff is bad, and the powerful deployment effect still intact. There is still a lot of value to be had here, no kidding, we'll get to that. But now a bit more thought needs to be applied as to whether the card fits in the needs of your deck. We'll see. So, story time. This is the second change to 20 Panzergrenadier. 20 Panzergrenadier on release looked different and then got changed. We're not going to go into that. You can look up the history if you want to. A change was made to 20 Panzergrenadier in which they dropped, basically, it used to be 3-4 and basically otherwise identical. Why is 20 Panzergrenadier an issue? So, 20 Panzergrenadier is basically an auto-include in any deck that includes Germany. With the only exception being decks that for some reason don't want really good infantry and tanks. Why? Because 20 Panzergrenadier is an incredibly high-value card. For 4 cost, as was the original, or at least the one that was in play before this balance patch, because actually the original was better than this. It's at 4 cost, 1 op cost, 3/3 infantry with Blitz. So in and of itself, it is a 3/3 body that you can push to the front line on turn 5, which is okay. It's a special, so why would it be a special being just an okay body? The reason is the deployment effect, because the deployment effect is add a Panzer 35T, that's the 2/2, 1 op cost tank, 2 cost deploy, 1 op cost, 2/2 tank, that reduces its op cost by 1 if you have an infantry in play, which of course you do, you just played 20 Panzergrenadier. Anyway, and Combined Arms, which is the order that gives a target tank +1/+1 for each unit type you control. So, for 8 credits, you could put this down, deploy a 35T, which would immediately reduce its op cost to 0, then play Combined Arms, turning the 2/2 35T into a 4/4 35T because it gets +2/+2 because you control a tank and an infantry, and then operate them both. Because they both have Blitz. Insane value. The change was, by the way, to reduce its previous defense of 4 to 3 to make it a bit more vulnerable. And at the time, I said that it would change nothing, as did other people. And we were right. It made no difference at all. None. Still an auto-include, still continuously used, because it was still just too good. The new change is frankly hilarious. But interesting. So the new change is that it is now 5 cost to deploy, and gets its defense back to 4, and remains otherwise unchanged. This is not going to go down well with some people. I personally think this is okay, and I'll talk about why in a minute, but there are some people who aren't going to like this, because the synergy, the value, and the sheer number of units that you get from this card are still going to rub people up the wrong way. The fact that it is self-synergizing gives you probably one of the best tanks in the game and a buff onto it is a thing, and people are now suddenly, not only is it, alright fine, it costs 1 more, but you've buffed its defense to make the infantry last longer. Reasons why this is actually okay. In the current meta, speed is everything, and has been for a while. Making this a turn later to deploy is important for the way that it affects Germany as a whole, as a nation. We'll get to that in a bit, but that is something I want you to bear in mind. This is not, in my opinion, a change that the developers focused on this card and this card alone for. I think the developers took time to actually sit down and consider where Germany was as a nation as a whole, and why it was one of the most played main nations and probably the most played ally in the game. And the reason is sheer value and speed. This card still has insane value. This is still an insanely good card. This is still going to play in most decks, but the fact that it's a turn slower is not nothing. Anyway, that's where I stand on it. I think it's all about how this interacts with other changes to Germany, and spoilers, it kinda does. Right, speaking of other changes to Germany, one of the most commonly seen cards in the meta right now, Blitz Doctrine. It creates insane amounts of conversation, has caused utter carnage, and become an absolute auto-include in any good competitive deck at the moment that runs tanks, because it's so good. Text time. This card has taken the battlefields by storm, not seen since June 1940. Cute joke, also very true. It offers excellent value for a small cost, so no wonder that it's blitzed its way into thousands of decks. Doubling the cost means it now finds itself in the much more cluttered 2-cost slot, and double Blitz Doctrine is slower to materialise, giving the opponent more time to find answers. Right, so those of you who follow my content will know I did indeed advocate for a change to this, and you will also know this is not the change I advocated for. We'll talk about why I'm kind of willing to give this a go and see if it makes a difference, but also why I'm not sure it will. So this is the simple change, which is just making it cost more, and it's been talked about a lot. So the original Blitz Doctrine, 1-cost order, develop a German light tank. It's a special, so you can run 2 of them. German light tank being any German tank that costs 3 or less. Let's not... there's a whole conversation about the historical accuracy of light and heavy and medium tank definitions, and 1939 could probably do themselves a favour by just changing the text to develop a German tank that costs 3 or less. But anyway... and then add Contest Doctrine to your hand. So, Contest Doctrine is a 3-cost order that develops a German medium or heavy tank, which is any tank that costs 4 or more, and gives your tanks that you deploy for the rest of the battle, +1/+1. Right. This is insane. The value of this card is exponential. This card replaces itself with a tank, adds a Contest Doctrine to your hand, which when played gives you a buff, and replaces itself with a tank. So this is effectively 3 cards. Which means it adds 2 cards to your deck size, and also gives you access to all of the tools to use the bonuses that you have. It's ridiculous. The change is to increase its cost to 2, to slow it down. Will this work? I'm cynical. I don't know that at 2 cost, yes, it's a more cluttered slot, but not really, because this thing was already, from a upper tier player's perspective, a questionable turn 1 play. Because really, I would advocate playing a 1-drop infantry if you've got it on turn 1 over playing this on turn 1, because this is value later and you need board position to take advantage of that value later, and losing early board position in an aggro-dominant meta is a terrible idea. In fact, I have won games against Blitz Doctrine when this has been the sequence that I've seen. Turn 1, Blitz Doctrine. Turn 2, another Blitz Doctrine, some random 1-cost. Turn 3, Contest Doctrine. Turn 4, Contest Doctrine all over again. By which time you're already in serious trouble, because despite the fact that you can deploy enormous vehicles, and you can, but it's not enough. It's not going to dig you out of the hole that you're in. So increasing the cost to 2 It does slow it down, but it doesn't do anything about the inherent value of this card. However, it does fit the intent that seems to be the designers on this, which is slowing down Germany. It fits the theme. Right, anyway, enough about Blitz Doctrine, because we also have Contest Doctrine, and we need to talk about them as a whole, so let's see whether Contest Doctrine remains the same. Spoilers, of course it doesn't. Contest Doctrine. Contest Doctrine has received a similar treatment as its parent. In addition to slowing the whole process down, we want it to be harder choice whether you can wait for your Contest Doctrine before you start deploying your cheap tanks. Against aggressive decks, you often won't have that luxury. You are correct. However, this isn't all aggro tool. And that's going to be the thing. So Contest Doctrine has had identical treatment to its parent. Literally, as I described before, it's a 3-cost order that says develop a German medium or heavy tank, and that is German tank that costs 4 or more. Tanks you deploy this battle get +1/+1. So, issues with this card that were concerning people. Obviously, developing a tank is kind of cool, but that wasn't the problem. The problem is the +1/+1, which is an incredibly strong buff, combined with the fact that it stacks with itself. So if you can play it, and then another one, heavens forfend you actually manage to get a third one by developing one somewhere. The buffs stack, and that's ridiculous. Anyway, the change to 4 credits. It fits the exact same theme. Slow it down. So let's see if it works. I do not want to criticise it directly. I don't know if this is strong enough. I don't know whether it stops this being as efficient an aggro tool. But, as I talked about when I did my own video in which I proposed that the changes to these cards were, in fact, to make the actions on these cards a choice between one of two. I proposed making Blitz Doctrine either get the tank now, or get Contest Doctrine for later, and Contest Doctrine be either get a big tank now, or get permanent +1/+1 to all of your tanks. That was my... For me, I wanted to see the value controlled a little better. However, I'm willing to give this a run, because combined with the other change that we have already seen to Panzergrenadier, and the fact that they've upped the cost on both of this card, these cards, this card, because they're sort of the same thing, yeah, it is going to slow it down. And slowing it down is good. It needs to slow down. There's no denying that. Is it enough? I don't know, because mid-range is still a thing, and in a mid-range deck or with ramp tools, I think, honestly, what you may be more likely, or we may be more likely to see, is just a lot more Germany decks running Iron from the North, or Reichsbank, or War Production from their US ally, to ramp fast enough to get this buff in the mid-game, and therefore just doing what a lot of people were tactically doing anyway, which is playing out the early game with their infantry units and then deploying massive tanks to put a push on and win at the end, as opposed to just playing this as an aggro tool. This definitely will affect the over-aggro variants of this deck. The Japan-Germany hyper-aggro variant of this deck in particular, under Germany-Japan, both of which are kind of the same deck but with slightly different directions, definitely been hit by this because this is now way too slow. So it does mean that this is less of a universal archetype card. So I'm good with that. But I'm not 100% convinced. However, I'm willing to wait and see. To Bomber Mafia, another card which has created an awful lot of conversation and become basically an auto-include, and a conversation about it. So let's roll down and read the text. The Bomber Mafia offers value you cannot refuse. Or it used to. Now that the regulatory committees and the IRS and the guidance counsellors have gotten involved, the deal has soured somewhat, with increased costs and bans on indiscriminate HQ bombing. Bloody bureaucrats, always ruining things. Note that the develop pool remains the same, as we want the production order bombers to have more avenues of showing up, and they are needed to keep the develop pool at a reasonable size. Right, so we'll get into that in a minute. Bomber Mafia has become a complete auto-include in any deck that runs US, even Brit Air, because it's amazing value. So the original order is 2 cost. It's a special, of course. Develop a US bomber. Deal 2 damage to all enemies if you have 6 or more unspent credits. So you play this on credit 8 or later. It drops, you develop a bomber from the pool of US bombers, and yes, as noted in the commentary before, that does include the spawnable bombers that you can get from production order, which is very powerful. And because you have 6 or more remaining credits, everything takes 2 damage, including your opponent's HQ. Bonkers. It's utterly insane. Literally game-changing. The change? 2 changes, in fact. Firstly, it is now 3 cost. That you could definitely see coming. Secondly, and I'm not overly shocked, develop a US bomber, deal 2 damage to all enemy units if you have 6 or more unspent credits. This is a perfectly reasonable change. Removing the damage to HQ is a good idea, increasing the cost is a good idea. This card just needed changing. It was way too good. It is still incredibly good, but it is now not ridiculous, and you also can't just pay 2 cost to win the game once you get your opponent's HQ down to 2. That said, I do understand those people who are not a fan of the spawnable bombers, the B-24J and B-24D from production order, being available in the pool for US bombers. I personally get why. Because you need the pool to be large enough that you're seeing 3 cards from a big enough pool that it doesn't become too predictable. That is a big part of the maths behind this sort of design, is making sure that any random pool is large enough that you're not over likely to consistently see the card that you want to see. Of course, a lot of the time, those are the cards you want to see. But there are some other really useful US bombers, and it can vary depending on where you are in the game as to what you want to take. Still, I honestly think on the whole this is a really good change. I think it's very well done. I think this puts the card in the good, strong, very playable, but not silly bracket. I think it will still see a huge amount of play and be quite popular. But on the whole, I think it's just vastly more balanced, and I'm kind of fine with it. I like this as a change. Well done, devs, honestly. I like it. I like the fact that you popped the HQ damage off, and I like the fact that you did that and increased the cost rather than doing one or the other. I think it's a good call. I think it puts the card where it should be. Oh boy, so it's time to strap in, because we're going to go towards Retribution, so I'm going to drink a little tea, and then we're going to talk. This is Yank, so let's read the thing. The Retribution mechanic is mostly intended to be bonus value for certain cards. We still wanted to offer the choice of going all out in the mechanic, but have it be slow and clunky enough not to be a real contender, similar to how we treat, for instance, draw denial and discard. Seems a lot of people like spinning their wheels, as the deck turned out to be a lot more popular than we anticipated. As I say, if you've been anywhere on other than Top End Ladder, you will have seen a huge amount of this deck. Even if its performance is not that great, it basically dies to anything that applies any kind of pressure. It depends on how you build it, but kinda, yeah. We do want the deck to exist still, but obviously it has to be even slower and less consistent. Right. And thus the change to Yank. Well, okay, it's the first of many changes, or at least 2 changes, and we'll talk about them both. So, this is one of the cards that I was not a fan of. So the original Yank is a 6 cost order, and it says, this battle, when you develop a card, also develop a Retribution. So every single time you develop a card, you get a Retribution as well as the card you develop for the rest of the battle for 6 cost. Develop is the mechanic where you see 3 cards from a pool of however many. In the case of Retribution, it's 12. In most cases, it's about 12. And pick one to add to your hand. The Retribution pool, I've done a whole video on it. You can go see me talking about the issues I have with the pool in general, and several of the cards in it, and in particular 2 of them. And we're going to talk about one of them in a minute. But the value on this card is utterly insane. It doubles the value of every Retribution you play. More than in the case of a very silly card, which we'll address in a minute. The change. 6 cost. This battle, the first time you develop each turn, also develop a Retribution. So, straight up, I'm not going to argue with this change, because this is the exact change that I proposed. My wording was different, but if you go back and watch my video, this is exactly the change that I proposed to this card, which is making it trigger only once per turn. Fine. I'm absolutely fine with it. I actually think it stops it being utterly ridiculous. I'm glad. Genuinely, I would like to think that, my opinion had some value in this. It's been thrown about often enough, but I highly doubt it did. But the reality is I'm very, very happy with the change. I think this genuinely is the right change to make, because it restrains this. It simply makes this a more restrained card. It is still very much worth 6. It is still very much an elite. It is still incredibly good value. So if you are the kind of person looking at this thinking, oh, it's destroyed my thing, it really hasn't. The value that was coming out of this was bonkers. And we'll talk about the whole thing in a minute, because I'll wrap up after we talk about the second one with my opinions on the changes to Retribution. But it's time to move on to the other Retribution card, which has been changed. This is a Retribution card, one of the 12 that you can develop. Right. Few things are more fun than making your opponent pay for their insolence, like daring to hurt your guys, though now you have to pay a bit more to make them pay. Following in the footsteps of the previous change, we are increasing the cost here by a whopping 50%. We don't want to remove the spin-wheeling potential completely, so the functionality remains the same. We could have gone for a more hardcore change, but chose to be softcore instead. We want to keep that PG-13 rating after all. Cute. I have opinions. But first, let's look at the actual change, talk about the issue, and then welcome to the world of me. So, this is a card that I have huge issues with. We're going to get to that in a minute, but let's look at it objectively as much as I can. So, the original card is 4 cost. Develop 2 Retributions. So, you develop this card, then you use it to develop 2 more cards, either or both of which could be another copy of develop 2 more Retributions. This is utterly ridiculous. It is silly, it is insane. Breathing. I have a problem with this. It is too much value. In fact, it is exponential, nigh infinite value. Anywho, the change. A whopping 50% increase to cost, going from 4 to 6. Right. This... It slows it down. It makes it less pervasive, sure, but you're talking about a card which is being played in ramp. There's going to be credits to do this. This is not enough. Sorry. From a purely mathematical point of view, yes, the change is significant. Yes, considering it also can't now proc off Yank, we are at the point whereby at least you don't develop this while developing another card, by the way, which could be another copy of this, at which point then you play both of those, which develops 4 cards, which doubles to 8, and let's say 2 of those turn out to be this, and then they double to another 2, and you've developed... However, it's not the point, and I will die upon this hill. Just remove this as an option. Change this card. There should not be, in a pool of developed cards, a card that develops 2 more of the developed cards, potentially including itself. Ever. That's it. But that is my opinion. As much as I understand the changes, as much as I'm sure that it is going to have some impact, it is not going to remove the biggest single issue with this, which is the utter tedium and really, really tilting experience of watching your screen fill with your opponent's card backs, and then one of 2 things happening. They magically have all of the tools they need to turn around an absolutely unwinnable board position, or they just quit because they didn't get it. Sorry, hard no. Literally, I just... no. The card shouldn't exist, and my opinion is unlikely to change on this. I do like the fact that it's now at least more expensive, but I still think it should just be obliterated. I do like the Yank change, though, and this is the thing. The Yank change helps. The Yank change helps a lot because it does slow the utterly, utterly insane wheel of this down, because at least it can't proc constantly. But the thing is that it's still making the random not random enough. I mean, I personally am not a huge fan of too much develop anyway. As I said, when the mechanic was first announced, little bit really good, too much going to be absolutely terrible and very, very bad experience for new players. I don't think this has changed that hugely, because this is still going to see playing ramp, and have you seen how well you can ramp nowadays? Also, to address the comment at the bottom about anything that applies pressure just killing this, kind of. However, there are a number of good attempts so far at delaying and guard spamming, and they're only going to get better. It's not like it's impossible to delay in this game. And the value on these cards is still really strong, because the pool is still strong. And again, this just shouldn't be in it. However, I'm willing to just sit down. For now, sure. At least Yank doesn't trigger. So a little more tea. Mint, if you're wondering. And we're on to the next big player. Now, this is one of the big 3. This is the 3rd of the big 3. This is Japan Aggro Self-Credit Denial, which is a deck that specialises in denying itself credit slots to benefit later on from having denied itself credit slots. I could link to videos. I've done a lot of conversation on this, and I'll probably go back over it again in a bit anyway, because we're going to have to make any sense of these changes. However, needless to say, it has become an incredibly strong deck, arguably one of the strongest decks in the game if you know what you're doing with it. Anyway, this is 5th Regiment, and it's being changed. The Self-Credit Denial, SKD deck, can attack from various angles, some early, some late, which is one of the reasons it can be so dangerous in the hands of a skilled pilot. Really, this is incredibly true. There are, mainly, 2 aspects of it that are causing some concern. One is the high rolly chance of getting a couple of 5th regiments out early, and quickly growing them into something most decks can't deal with at that stage. We're tackling that issue here by reducing how quickly it can grow into a threat. This also makes the choice of which bonus mode to trigger it on harder. Right, so we'll get into it, because this isn't easy. So, the deal with self-credit denial is there are cards that you can play that have effects. There's a regiment in the form of the 40th Cavalry, which you can play, which is an incredibly good regiment for its cost, but that also loses you a credit slot when you deploy it. There is Desperate Measures, which deals 2 damage to all enemy units and loses you a credit slot. There is a 1-cost order that develops a card in your deck, which is a serious thing. Anyway, we're not going to get into that yet because it's not in this patch. But also loses you a credit slot. You get the theme. Now, 5th Regiment is one of the payoff cards for this. It gains a benefit from every time you self-credit deny. So, the original 5th Regiment, 4 cost, 0 operation cost, 4/4 infantry, which is frankly already incredibly good. A 4/4 infantry for 4 is decent. You'd like it to have Blitz, but it doesn't. But that's okay, kinda, because it has 0 op cost, which is huge. And it says, also it's a standard, you can run a full 4 of these. When you lose a credit slot, this unit gets +2/+2 if on the battlefield, or -2 cost if in hand. This is insane. This can be used multiple ways. So the first way that you can use this is that you can self-credit deny early to get 4/4 bodies out early with 0 op cost, which can be hard for anyone to handle, and then the next time you self-credit deny, it suddenly becomes a 6/6, and that can be a serious problem. The second way that this can be used is to time your self-credit denial with very good precision to take advantage of a card called One Roof, which lets you... It's a 5-cost order that gets you 2 credits for every... Instantaneously gets you 2 credits available for every single credit slot that you've lost previously in the game. So once you get to having self-credit denied yourself 4 times, you pay 5 to get 8 credits back, and it draws you 2 cards, hopefully one of which is One Roof, which you then pay 5 to exponentially, and you gain exponential credit gain. So you end up with a huge pile of credits, usually somewhere in the region of 18 to 24. Then, having drawn a crap ton of cards, you play out a bunch of units, hopefully already having some of these on the board, but if you don't, you certainly get some onto it. Then, you self-credit deny yourself again. Hard. Try and take your remaining 5 credits, or however many you happen to have, your 5 credit slots, however many you happen to have at the time that you play One Roof, and you get them down to 1 or 0. You just hard roll. And in the process of dropping those 5 credit slots, you've given all your 5th regiments +10/+10. So these are now 14/14s. Then you play another card called the Great Expanse, which we're going to get to in a minute, which gives them another huge buff, and you end up with insanely sized cards. This is the other way that you can play this. And you can actually do combinations. These aren't the only 2 ways that you can play this. There are many, many ways that you can carefully mitigate this. You can do bursts of One Roofing to put tempo bursts onto the board. If your deck's not drawing where you want it to, you can actually control the tempo. But again, you have to be, and I will emphasize this, you have to be a very skilled pilot to do it well. If you can do it well, you can do truly extraordinary things with this deck. It is incredibly versatile. It is a ton of fun to play in short bursts. It is mentally extremely taxing. For me, at least. I'm sure there are others who love playing this and would say it's really relaxing to play, but I'm pretty good at head maths. In fact, I'm very good at head maths, and I find this deck taxing. Anyway, the point is, change to this. Now, when we talked about self-credit denial, I proposed limiting the actual One Roof card. And then I got into a conversation with some other people who know a great deal about what they're talking about, and was actually convinced to change my mind. I did talk in the video I did about Balance Patch about what I would do if instead of going for One Roof, I went for the rest of the cards. And there are changes in there, and this is on that list. I think this exact change is on that list. Anyway, so here's the change. 4 cost, 0 op cost, 4/4, all still the same. However, slight change in text. When you lose a credit slot, this unit gets +1/+1 if on the battlefield, or -2 cost if in hand. Now, I did posit when talking about this that the devs might not like this for the asymmetry of +1 and -2, but I did say that I personally thought it was the right change, and I stand by that. I think this is a very well-balanced change to 5th Regiment. If you are changing 5th Regiment, I think this is the correct way to change it. I've heard people say op cost, giving this an op cost would be fair. It wouldn't actually be fair, it would just make it pointless. The whole point of self-credit denial is you need 0 op cost units because of how hard you're hitting yourself. This, limiting how fast this grows, is good. Leaving it asymmetrically, as I said in my commentary on this, is also good, because it means you don't feel the inclination to reduce the cost of it. If this was +1/+1 and -1 cost in hand, you'd have to look at changing the cost, and you don't want to do that because you want to keep this on curve and not let it get out of hand. This is a good rework. I thoroughly approve of it, and I think this puts this card in a usable but not ridiculous bracket. I really genuinely am very happy with this change, and I know other people who are going to be too. If you were going to change this card, this was the way to do it. So, great job to the dev team on this. They clearly had the same thought processes, or listened to the people who were talking. I'm sure I'm not one of them. Anyway, moving on to another part of the self-credit denial package, we get to the Great Expanse. Now, this is the card I was talking about earlier. So, the other concern regarding SKD decks is that when they get their engine running, culminating in chaining 1 roofs into the Great Expanse for massive gains. Ideally, this leads to instant victory, but sometimes it's enough just to buff your army to take total control of the battlefield. Now the latter is harder, as the defensive part of the buff is gone. And no, we're not going to rename the card now to the Not-So-Great Expanse. Stop asking. Again, whoever did the writing for this, props. I like it. The tone is right for this, and I'll get to that at the end. Right, the Great Expanse, the original card which I was talking about previously, is a 4-cost order. It's an elite, so you only have 1, although you can spawn copies of it because you have access to Air, Land and Sea, which develops a card in your deck, so theoretically you can play more than 1 of them. Lord knows, most of the time you wouldn't need to. And the Great Expanse says, set your credit slots to equal the enemy credit slots. Your units gain +1/+1 for each slot gained. This is immense, because you are self-credit denying, and, as I say in a perfect world, have put your credit slots to 1 or 0, ideally 0, and your opponent probably has 9 or 10. So you're effectively giving +9/+9 to your already 14 14s, which are now 23 23s. And this is what we're talking about the second half of the issue here. This does have burst win the game impact, but that's actually not the big problem with it. There are plenty of burst win the game cards in this game, from the overcosted Ancestral Call to the neatly and cleanly costed Blitz Blitzkrieg through to the remarkably cost-effective Close Combat, and so on and so forth. Rule Britannia. There's the Soviet bonuses. There are a number of big burst win-the-game cards, but they mostly only give you attack buffs. And here you go. That's literally what they did. 4 cost, set your credit slots equal to the enemy credit slots. Nothing's changed, except you only get +1 attack for each slot gained. I love this change. I love this change because this change makes this card what it should be, which is a finisher, not a mid-range control or tempo tool. Beyond compare. This no longer just hands you the long game on a plate if you misplay. This is the key. This change means that misplaying your one roof turns on this deck is fatal. And it wasn't. As long as you managed to drop a decent Great Expanse, even if you got lost in the maths or mistimed something and it didn't quite go according to plan, you had huge bodies. It was too forgiving. This makes the deck even more technical to play, and I approve of that because I love that that's what this deck is. I adore that this deck is in fact so technical to play, so pilot skill dependent. More power to the devs for this change. Honestly, hands up, my change wasn't as clean as these. Just wasn't. I'd still like to see Air, Land and Sea tweaked somehow, but that's a different conversation. And we'll have to wait and see as to whether it still remains necessary, because these are pretty hefty changes when combined together to the heart of this already very potent deck. So yeah, I'm good with this. I think it's going to make playing this deck feel much more knife-edgy, and that's a good thing, because it should. I think that will be the fun part about this. I like that this change exists. Okay, so moving on, we arrive at British Commandos, which I didn't actually expect to see in this. We've gone past nerfs, by the way. We're into buffs. Right. This is Night Raid. So far in this blog, we've been delivering some tough discipline to some naughty cards. Kinda, yeah. Now it's time for some tough love, starting with Night Raid. Some would argue Commandos are the epitome of naughtiness, but naughty boys require some love every now and then too. I couldn't agree more. I love playing Commandos. Night Raid has fallen out of favour for various reasons, yet should be a solid choice for any Commandos decks. Let's see if a little bit of love leads to more flower power. Again, I do want to know who wrote this blog. If you're out there, if for some reason you watch this, or someone from 1939 watches this, please drop me a Discord line. I'd just like to know who did the writing, because I like it, it's good. Night Raid. So Night Raid is, or rather was, a 5-cost order, and it said, special, and it said, copy a random order from the enemy deck and add a number 10 commando to the support line. Number 10 commando is the little commando dude who, every time you give an order, does 1 point of damage to a random enemy. It's the beating heart of the Pew Pew Commandos deck. It's great fun to play. It's never going to be immensely overpowered, but it's fun and enjoyable, and there are some really cool things you can do with it. Night Raid was falling out of favour because it was very, very expensive. It's very slow. However, this is a really nice buff. They've just reduced the cost to 4. I love this change. I love this change because it's not silly, it's not overpowered, it's not even hitting something that's a major issue at the minute. It's just polishing up a British deck that isn't air that you can have fun with. I love Commandos. I'm probably going to be playing some in the relatively near future because I like this change. And certainly, I mean, I was still running Night Raid because I'm a hardcore Commandos lover. This just makes my Night Raid so much better. For cost, for getting an extra order and an extra commando. Yes, please. Really good change. Absolutely fine with it. Next up, the T-35. Soviet time. So, the Soviets may be struggling at the moment. They really are. We'll get to that in a minute. But they have several decks that are on the cusp of being good in the meta. One of these is the self-damage deck. Nah, that's sort of true. The T-35 was always intended to be a solid piece in that deck, but never really took off. Must be all that heavy metal. Again, well done. By moving the effect to trigger at the end of the turn, you are almost guaranteed at least one hit, which is often enough to get the ball rolling. So, T-35 is a 2-cost, 1-op cost tank. It is a 2/3, and it says deal 1 damage to each HQ at the start of your turn. Right. Why on earth would you want to do this? You would want to do this because there are many Soviet cards that trigger bonuses off your HQ taking damage. Anything from gaining buffs while they're on the field to gaining discounts to their deployment cost. It's actually it's a core Soviet archetype that isn't heavily played because it's still not quite there. One of the reasons it's not quite there is the T-35, which you play and then your opponent utterly obliterates the instant he can on his turn. Or they can on their turn, I should say. A complete Freudian slip. But the instant your opponent can remove this, they do, because they don't want this to trigger. Having this trigger at the end of your turn, and that's the change, it now deals 1 damage to each HQ at the end of your turn, is actually huge. Because you can play it, and unless your opponent has a countermeasure, you get the proc. It's really good. I like this as a change. Is it going to be enough to revitalise Soviet self-damage? I have no idea. The Soviets are in serious trouble right now. There are basically no upper-end viable Soviet decks. None. However, this makes me want to go and look at self-damage again. Next up, 60th Cavalry Regiment. The 60th Cavalry Regiment lives to laugh at those that enjoy the wheel spinning we talked about earlier. The problem it has is that it lives in a limbo in being too slow against aggro decks and applies too little pressure against control decks. It's now statted to be able to go up against aggro units a lot faster, which starts hampering control decks a lot sooner. Blitz Doctrine into Contest Doctrine? I don't think so. Right. Let's talk about the card. So 60th Cavalry did not see a huge amount of play for a number of reasons. 60th Cavalry is a 4-cost, 1-op cost, 3/6 infantry. It's a lot of body. With ambush, it's a special, and it says players can only give 1 order each turn. On the face of this is a great card because restricting players to being able to give 1 order each turn is a big hamper for several decks. Crippling for commandos. Really quite bad for Blitz Doctrine if you want to Blitz Doctrine into Contest Doctrine or develop a card and go into it. It's really also quite bad against Retribution because, again, you can only give 1 order a turn, but it's so slow at 4 cost that no one played it. This has had a big buff. Doesn't look like it, because on the face of it, it looks like it's been nerfed. It is now a 2-cost, 1-op cost, 2/4 infantry. Doesn't have ambush anymore, and maintains players can only 1 order each turn. On the face of this is a terrible, terrible thing, because it doesn't have ambush anymore, and it's got less health and less attack, but it's half the cost. Half. This takes it as a 2-drop. As a 2-drop, this is actually interesting. I don't know how good it's going to be because I haven't had a chance to play this because the patch isn't out yet. But I am interested. It does make me raise an eyebrow because that is not a small change. Really isn't. 2's a good price for this. I think this unit has the potential to see Soviet play quite regularly into a lot of the current meta because, as I say, it's going to make certain decks very sad. Right. Allies time. We have an Italian thing. Right. Italy control was once a mainstay of the meta, but has been in steady decline for a while now. This is indeed apparently very true. Bringing the stat line of this former stalwart of the deck to be more in line with the modern cards ecosystem hopefully brings it back from extinction. Few things are sadder than endangered Italians, but buffing La Decima should be a solid first step into making Italian control 10 out of 10 again. I certainly hope so. I like a good control deck. Let's look at the change. So La Decima is an 8 cost, or was an 8 cost 2/4 infantry that has ambush, guard. It's a special for a reason, because it also has deployment. Destroy target unit in the enemy support line. No restrictions, no with attack this or blah that, it's just destroy. My god, this powerful effect, but it's 8 cost. It's just so late game. The change, and it isn't a small one, is that La Decima is now 7 cost, 1 op cost, and 2/5. This is great. This is really strong. Is it enough on its own to put Italy control back in play? I don't know, but it's strong. This does make Italy an interesting control ally choice, because 2 of this is a good include in any control deck. Because this is removal, guard with ambush, and a really decent defense value. Yes, its attack's a little lackluster, but is not bad. Is really not bad. I quite like this. I think it's really interesting. It was unexpected. Wasn't really on my radar as a thing that was going to happen. It's a buff that came out of nowhere for me. I expected to see Soviet buffs, but this and the Commandos buff really shocked me. In a good way. Shows that there's a broader thinking going on, which is good sign from a development team. Right, speaking of development teams, that's it. Some final thoughts. Based on our data, Britair and various aggro shells revolving around Blitz Doctrine have seen the most success post-Covert Operations. The new SKD deck performs very well in experienced hands, but the tricky sequencing it demands makes it only decently successful overall. The greedy ramp Retribution package is very popular, but has middling success. It can, however, be annoying to play against simply because of the game's dragging out with endless developing. These decks were our main focus for adjustments in this patch. Overall, there are a lot of playable decks in the meta, some of them on the cusp of being competitive. Our hope is, with this update, is to allow some of the strategies overshadowed by those overtuned cards to shine. We will continue to monitor the meta and your feedback over the summer, ready to step in again as needed once we have soaked up enough sun to last us through the winter months. Until then, see you on the battlefield, Commander. So, 1939 taking a summer break, very understandable. The summary at the base of this, also pretty good. Okay, so the balance patch sign off. First of all, I approve of that. They've been. I like that they're being at least a little bit open about what their data is showing them, and it matches up with my own much less well researched, because I don't have the tools data, in the way that the decks are impacting. It shows that they are paying attention to not only what is being heavily played and how successful it's being, but also to the voices of people who are talking about what is really just not fun to play into. Retribution, we are looking at you. So I think that's great. I think that is good to see. I think it's good that they're talking about that, and I really hope we're going to see more of that, because I personally love developers being open about what they're doing and why they're doing it and the data that they're doing it based on. And by the way, I would adore to have someone from the 1939 development team in an interview at some point, or someone's, because I think it would be great to actually chew the fat over some of the design choices. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this as a balance patch. There are some things that I'm not so happy about. In particular, the existence, the still remaining existence of Develop 2 Retributions is a point that I will not concede. Not because I think it's going to take over the world. As I've said repeatedly, Ramp Retribution is not actually that strong of a deck. It's just incredibly annoying. But because the existence of a card that is created and can create itself bothers me. The changes to Blitz Doctrine are different than the ones I would have made, and I don't know if they're going to be strong enough to actually alter the impact substantially. I still expect Blitz Doctrine to be very heavily seen and played. I think it might be enough to make it less dominant, because it is less appealing now to straight aggro decks. But its value into heavier aggro decks, like chunky aggro, cusping on mid-range, is really good, and its value for a mid-range deck is still insane. Because it is still creating too much for one card, in my opinion. We'll see. I'm willing to give it time and see if the changes do actually work. As I said, Bomber Mafia, beautiful change, very happy with it. Shark was a change that, as I said at the top, it would depend on whether the other changes were strong enough, and I think they probably are enough that the Shark change is justified. I think Britair will still be competitive. SKD changes I'm very happy with because they've gone in a smart direction, and I like that, and it's the direction that I was slowly coming around to myself, which is always nice to see. Change to Yank I'm not going to argue about because it's the change that I argued for. On the whole, yeah, I like this. I think it's solid. I think it's a good balance patch to settle things, hopefully, over the summer. I hope it's strong enough to put Blitz Doctrine from being super dominant. And just as an aside, we finally saw an actually impactful change to 20 Panzergrenadier in the sense that they made it slower. I will say, I'm still not sure it's enough. I still think the thing about it is that Germany still is getting insane value. But we'll see, because the cumulative effect of the Germany changes are interesting to me, because it is slowing all of the big tools, or at least most of them, which I'm quite happy to see. On the whole, I think I'm happy with this as a balance patch, as one that has been well thought out, and now it's just going to be about waiting and seeing how it actually impacts the meta and what changes we get over the summer before 1939 are back for the next big part of it, and I get needing to take a summer break, and that's all good by me. Anyway, these are my thoughts, literally, on the day of the patch being made public via dev blog. I'd be interested to see in the comments what other people think. Obviously, you can reach out to me commenting down below. You can join Discord. There is also a link down below. I have my Discord. You can come chat to me there. You can reach out to me on social media. Find me on the Cards main Discord. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff because I think it's really interesting. As ever, I hope it's been interesting and useful and enjoyable, because I try and be at least a little bit entertaining. And as always, please stay well, be good human beings, and I will catch you next time.